There was a time when winter was not an inconvenience but a death sentence. A 6-month death sentence handed down by the wind. For the Appalachian people living in their isolated log cabins, this reality was especially harsh. No heating bills, no stores, no emergency services. Just you, 4 walls of roughly hewn logs, and cold that could freeze a person to death in a matter of hours. Temperatures could drop to minus 40 degrees. Snowstorms could bury a cabin under 15 feet of white silence, and by spring there would be no trace of a human being left. In this world, a settler had to be more than just a survivor. He had to be a master of the cold. His life depended on forgotten techniques and a deep, intuitive understanding of heat, fire, and the merciless laws of nature. This was not a world of comfort. It was a world of practical knowledge. But what ancient methods, long forgotten, can save a life today? We explore the lost science of survival. Watch until the end to find out which skills meant the difference between freezing to death and waking up alive. The hearth was not just a fireplace. It was the thermal heart of the hut. Settlers did not just build fires, they built real heaters. The main method was thermal mass, the physical ability of a material to absorb, store, and then slowly and evenly release heat. Their fireplaces were often massive structures made of rough stone, river pebbles, or adobe bricks, sometimes weighing several tons. The difference between these hearths and modern fireplaces is enormous. While a conventional fireplace quickly heats the air, but also cools down quickly, a massive stone hearth, once heated, radiated heat for hours, long after the flames had died down. This heat was not instantaneous, it was stable and reliable, which is critical in cold conditions when every moment of delay could cost lives. The hearth itself was embedded in one of the main walls, which was a critical element of the design. This design ensured that heat was not lost through a separate pipe, but directly heated the structure of the hut. Smoke and harmful gases were, of course, vented through a stone chimney, but the enormous heat from the fire was absorbed by the stone behind it. The stones, heated during the day, continued to radiate heat into the room long after midnight, like a huge, slowly cooling radiator. It was a primitive but ingenious form of radiant heating for the walls and floor. In the modern world, we would call this passive thermoregulation, but for these people, it was simply knowledge forged by experience. For additional insulation, a mixture of dirt, straw, and sometimes even animal wool, a technique known as caulking, was used to fill the gaps between the logs. This was not just to stop drafts. It was a scientific application of insulation. Every strand of straw and wool mixed with mud created millions of tiny air pockets. As we know from physics, trapped air is an excellent insulator, and the porous, straw-filled caulking created this barrier. This significantly reduced convective heat loss, the escape of warm air from the hut and the inflow of cold air through the gaps. Without this simple but labor-intensive process, no hearth could effectively heat a dwelling. Have you heard of this method? Write in the comments and tell us where you are watching us from. Maintaining a continuous fire was a monumental task, especially when flint, steel, and tinder were precious and difficult to obtain. For a frontier settler, starting a fire was not just the beginning of the day, but a laborious process requiring effort and precious resources. Therefore, the skill of the frontier settler lay not in starting a fire, but in keeping it going for days, even weeks. This technique was known as bedding or preserving coals and was one of the most important survival skills. At the end of the day, when the fire was no longer needed for cooking, lighting, or heating, the settler used a special shovel-like tool, sometimes called a coal poker, to rake the smoldering, red-hot coals to the back of the hearth. This was the place most protected from drafts. He then covered these coals with a thick layer of ash, forming a dome-shaped mound. This ash was not just waste, but a key element of the system. It served a dual purpose. First, it insulated the coals, preventing oxygen from reaching them and thus slowing down the burning rate. Second, it kept the heat in, like a thermos. This was not just a routine, but a daily ritual of survival that guaranteed a warm morning. In the morning, the settler simply raked the ashes, found the still smoldering, ash-covered coals, and added new chips and large pieces of wood. The smoldering fire could last from 8 to 12 hours, allowing them to sleep through the night, knowing that they would not have to spend time and effort starting a new fire in the morning. It was a reliable source of heat and a way to avoid the laborious process of starting a fire from scratch every morning. But what do you do when the fire goes out at night? The temperature drops below freezing, and your life depends on rekindling it in complete darkness and bitter cold? We'll soon tell you what solutions they found in such desperate situations. The design of the hut was not accidental. It was an architectural solution aimed at survival. The Appalachian people built their dwellings using the principle of a thermal buffer zone. In most cases, the hut consisted of a single room with an open hearth, but the doors and windows were designed to minimize heat loss. The door was often small and opened inward, allowing it to be pressed tightly against the door jamb by air pressure. The outer door could also be covered with a simple skin or blanket, creating an additional air barrier. This method, known as curtaining, was a simple and incredibly effective way to prevent heat loss. The most notable feature was the location of the huts. They were often built at the foot of a hill or on a slope facing south. This was not just a beautiful spot, it was a strategic choice. This location allowed the huts to take advantage of natural barriers against the north winds, which could bring deadly cold, and to receive maximum sunlight throughout the day. The hill or earthen slope that served as the back wall acted as an additional heat mass and insulator, slowing down the freezing of the hut. In addition, the ground beneath the hut also provided a stable temperature, slowing down the freezing of the floor, which was especially important when the floor was made of compacted earth. In addition, many huts were designed to maximize convection heat. The hearth was often located at the far end of the door. Warm air, being lighter than cold air, rose to the ceiling and, as it cooled, descended, circulating throughout the room. It wasn't a perfect system, but combined with the thermal mass of the hearth and proper insulation, it was an effective solution. Today, we would call it passive solar design, but for them, it was simply a matter of survival. The choice of fuel was just as important as the hearth itself. Settlers didn't just chop down any tree, they picked them based on density and moisture content. Pine, for example, burns quickly and brightly, but provides little long-lasting heat. This was good for quick heating, but not for long-term heating. In contrast, oak, maple, and hickory are slow-burning woods. Their wood is dense and provides a steady, hot heat for many hours. Harvesting such wood was one of the most important tasks in the summer and fall months, as it ensured survival during the winter. The wood had to be dried. Freshly cut wood, which contains a lot of moisture, uses a significant part of the fire's energy to evaporate it, producing more smoke than heat. Therefore, trees were felled in advance, cut into logs, and carefully stored under a canopy so that they could dry out over several months or even a year. The efficiency of heating depended directly on the moisture content of the fuel. The drier the wood, the more heat it gave off. What could be done if it was not possible to gather and dry enough wood? This was a matter of life and death. In such cases, old stumps, roots, and dead wood found in the forest were used. It was dry but contained little energy and was difficult to chop. This problem required either extreme thriftiness or, in the worst case, burning furniture, parts of the fence, or even parts of the hut itself. This was a last resort, a desperate measure that showed how important planning was. But what could be done if, even in a well-heated house, the cold still penetrated inside and there was not enough heat to survive? The interior of the hut was just as important as its construction. In conditions where fuel was scarce, every degree of heat was worth its weight in gold, and retaining it required a deep understanding of physics. Settlers used layered clothing to create air pockets between the layers, which acted as a natural insulator. The main materials for clothing and blankets were wool, animal skins, and even woven rags known as rag blankets. Wool, unlike cotton, has a unique property. Even when wet, it retains heat because its fibers create many air pockets. These air pockets slow down the transfer of heat from the body to the environment, preventing heat from escaping. Blankets were strategically important. At night, when the hearth cooled and the temperature in the hut dropped, people would wrap themselves in a kind of cocoon made of blankets. The layers of blankets, especially those made of thick wool or animal skins, not only kept people warm, but also created a vapor barrier. Moisture released by the body was trapped in the lower layers, creating a microclimate that helped retain heat. This was vital, as cold, damp air is a much more efficient conductor of heat than dry air and could lead to dangerous hypothermia. Fur and skins were not just used for clothing, they also served as rugs on the earthen floor, insulating curtains on doors, and even as an extra layer on the walls to reduce the impact of the cold. All of this was aimed at reducing convective heat loss and minimizing the penetration of cold. It wasn't just comfort, it was applied thermodynamics aimed at survival. Every piece of fabric, every skin, was part of a complex system where every detail mattered. Winter survival did not begin in November, but in the height of summer, when nature was at its most generous. Strategic preparation was not just work, but a life cycle that determined whether a family would go hungry and freeze. This process was planned and comprehensive. First of all, wood for heating was harvested and dried. This was the most important resource. The settlers did not simply chop down trees. They carefully selected suitable species, such as oak or maple, which burned longer and provided more heat. The wood was then stored in such a way as to ensure maximum air circulation for drying. In addition to the main fuel, other more flammable materials were collected for kindling: dry leaves, moss, small branches, and bark. It was a painstaking and labor-intensive process that required not only planning, but also tremendous physical endurance. Settlers had to calculate exactly how much fuel they would need to survive the long and harsh winter and where they could find it. Preparation continued until the first frosts, when the approach of cold weather could already be felt. Hunting and meat preparation were also an integral part of this cycle. Animals caught in the fall, when they were at their fattest, had to be preserved properly. Methods such as salting and smoking not only prevented spoilage, but also significantly increased the calorie content of food, making it an ideal source of energy. For example, a smoked ham or a large piece of salted bacon could provide a family with the necessary fats and proteins for many weeks. These high-calorie reserves were the main source of energy needed to maintain body temperature in the constant cold and played a key role in survival. Appalachian settlers also actively gathered wild plants and berries. They dried them, turning them into reliable supplies for the winter. Anything that could be used as food, from edible roots, such as wild carrots or burdock, to wild nuts and berries, was harvested and carefully stored. Fatty nuts and dried berries, which were a source of vitamins, were carefully stored in bags and clay pots. This was not just preparation for winter, it was resource management in conditions of absolute isolation, where every detail mattered. But what to do with a deep wound, say, from cutting wood, when the nearest doctor is 800 kilometers away? We'll soon tell you how they solved this problem using the gifts of the wild. Heat is energy. If it is not available from outside, it must be generated from within. And for the inhabitants of the Appalachians, this was a matter of survival. Therefore, their diet was directly linked to heating their own bodies. A high-calorie diet consisting of fatty meat, nuts, root vegetables, and lard was essential for the body to produce heat energy. The body expended enormous amounts of calories just to maintain body temperature in the constant cold. For example, a piece of smoked lard or fatty game meat provided not only satiety, but also a long-lasting, slowly released source of internal energy that allowed the body to fight the cold effectively. Activity also played a key role in maintaining body heat. During the day when it was necessary to chop wood, carry water, hunt, or perform other physical work, the body generated heat through movement. However, during periods of rest, such as at night, body temperature naturally dropped. This is why thermoregulation was so important. Settlers slept close to each other whenever possible to share body heat. This was not just a common practice. It was an instinctive application of the physical laws of heat transfer, where one body helped warm another. In this way, even sleep became a collective survival strategy. Energy management was as important as managing fuel for the hearth. Conserving body heat was one of the most important survival skills. People avoided unnecessary movement so as not to waste energy and wore layered clothing to keep the heat in. Wool or animal skins were often used for this purpose. Every step, every decision, from how tightly to wrap oneself in a blanket to when to build a fire, was aimed at preserving precious heat, which was the only guarantee that they would survive the night. It was a constant battle with nature, in which every calorie and every movement was carefully considered. Fire was not only a source of heat, but also the main source of light in the harsh Appalachian environment. However, during periods when fuel was scarce or to conserve it for the night, settlers turned to alternative light sources that also provided a small amount of heat. These were candles made from carefully collected and processed animal fat. Fat, especially mutton or beef, was an extremely valuable resource that could not be wasted thoughtlessly. The process of preparing it was as important as the product itself. The fat was melted in large cauldrons, then purified of impurities, a process called rendering. After that, the purified liquid fat was poured into special molds. A wick made of twisted cotton, linen thread, or even a strip of old fabric was placed in the center of the mold. When the fat solidified, a candle was formed. A burning candle not only gave off a soft but sufficient light, allowing people to do small tasks in the dark, such as mending clothes or reading, but also provided a small amount of heat. In addition, the candle flame helped dry the air in the room, making it feel warmer and more comfortable. But even the use of fat was part of a large and well-thought-out survival ecosystem. Fat that was not used for candles had many other uses. It could be used as a base for primitive balms and ointments. These ointments helped protect the skin from frostbite, chapping, and cracking, which was critical in conditions of constant cold and hard physical labor. Thus, the same resource, animal fat, performed several vital functions. It provided light, protected against the cold, and served as medicine. This was not simply a matter of using resources. It was a comprehensive and waste-free application of them, demonstrating the remarkable ingenuity and thriftiness of the Appalachian settlers. Modern homes have complex ventilation systems to ensure a constant flow of fresh air and prevent the buildup of harmful gases. Modern technology allows us to enjoy comfort and safety. In frontier cabins, where every board and log was cut by hand, ventilation was essentially non-existent. The only sources of fresh air were poorly fitted cracks in the walls and, of course, the door. These cracks were caused by the drying of the wood and the imperfection of the tools. The settlers did not think about air quality. Their only goal was to stay warm. For them, acrid smoke was a lesser evil than the freezing wind. The hearth was the main source of air exchange. The smoke rising up the chimney created a natural draft that pulled air out of the room. This process, known as the chimney effect, was the only way to remove combustion products. At the same time, fresh, icy air entered through the cracks between the logs and the poorly closed doors and windows. This uncontrolled and inefficient process often led to strong drafts, which made the hut even colder and more uncomfortable. The warm air that had been so carefully accumulated escaped through these cracks and was replaced by cold air. However, in severe cold weather, the settlers did everything they could to minimize air penetration. The cracks were plugged with rags, moss, or dirt mixed with straw to create some kind of barrier. It was painstaking but vital work. This led to the accumulation of smoke and soot, which covered the walls and ceiling. But it also retained precious heat, preventing it from escaping outside. It was a sacrifice of comfort for survival, and the choice was obvious. People preferred to breathe smoke rather than freeze to death. A warm body releases moisture, which can condense on cold surfaces. This moisture, in turn, can cause clothing and linen to become wet. In conditions where drying clothes was a difficult task, this could be fatal, as wet clothes cannot retain heat and led to hypothermia. Settlers solved this problem using methods that we would today call humidity control. First, they tried to keep things dry by hanging clothes on special poles above the hearth. This was the only way to dry clothes in conditions of constant dampness. The second method was to use blankets and skins as a vapor barrier to keep moisture away from the body. Thanks to their structure, these materials did not allow moisture to pass through to the body and clothing. The third method was to use the heat from the hearth to dry the air. Hot ashes and stones covered with ashes absorb moisture, creating a dry microclimate in the hut. It was a primitive but effective method of combating dampness, which could lead to hypothermia. Winter on the frontier was not just a season, but a deadly enemy that could not be defeated, but with which one could negotiate. This fierce, unforgiving world forced people to become engineers, physicists, and survival strategists. Their methods were not the result of academic knowledge. They were forged in the crucible of harsh reality. They were based on observation, intuition, and an absolute understanding that every resource, every calorie, and every ounce of heat mattered. These people left us not only a history, but a lesson. A lesson that nature has no sentiment and that survival always depends on practical knowledge. This knowledge seems to have been lost, but perhaps it still lurks in our DNA. Write in the comments which of these methods you found most surprising, and what would you like to see in future episodes? Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss other stories about survival and lost knowledge.